Okay, so we are now recording. So welcome to this first of a series of 4 orientations for new state ombudsman. Normally this would have happened during the conference in Pittsburgh in 2020, but we're going to be doing it virtually, which I think we'll still get the information across in a good and timely way. Our speaker today is Louise Ryan. Louise is the Ombudsman Specialist for the Administration for Community Living, and she's going to be talking about Ombudsman 101, and we're ready to go.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, and hello, everybody. It's great to see many of you. I'm so sorry we're not in person, but at least I can see you on the screen, so that's great. So today I'm just going to talk about what I call Ombudsman 101. And I think when I did this before, I had more time. So we may not cover everything in depth because I know some things we're going to cover down the road. So I might kind of skip over a few things. But I just wanted to kind of give a perspective of ombudsman work based on my kind of observations and experiences, having been at ACL since 2011, and then prior to that, I was Washington State Ombudsman. So just have kind of a depth of knowledge over the years. So what I want to do is talk about quickly about ACL, and then I'm going to talk about something that I call an assessment. And then talk a little bit more about your functions and responsibilities, a little bit about NORS, probably not much because we'll do more later, and a little bit about other agencies and legal services. But I want to leave time for questions. So, okay, go ahead, next slide. So the Administration for Community Living, it's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. We're called a division of Health and Human Services. And within the Administration for Community Living is the Administration on Aging. And basically what happened is that in 2012, several small divisions joined together to become ACL. So what happened with the Administration on Disabilities, for instance, joined with AOA, and then later the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living came to ACL. So basically we become Aging and Disability, and with what we call NIDLR, the Institute on Disability, that has a research arm as well. But a couple things to be aware of. You may be aware of what's called the Protection and Advocacy System, the Centers for Independent Living, the State Health Insurance Systems Program, and the DD Council. Those, when I was State Ombudsman, I interacted with all of those other entities, and they are all now under ACL. So it helps us at ACL to have that internal coordination. Next slide. The mission of ACL is to maximize the independence, well-being, and health of older adults, people with disabilities across the lifespan, and their families and caregivers. So when I think of the Ombudsman program, I think of that independence and well-being and health, of course, all fits in to that mission. Next slide. So just a few reminders I want to say about ACL and the Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman programs within ACL. And actually, this is the condensed version. If you looked at the previous PowerPoint, you would have seen that Again, the Administration on Aging is within ACL. When I first came to federal government, I was hired by the Administration on Aging. Now we're within a slightly larger agency. But anyhow, the ACL's Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman Programs is, I'm a federal employee, for instance, so I'm not an ombudsman. And anything that's shared in writing, say an email, all of that is subject to Freedom of Information Act. So even though at your state level, your communications are not subject to that, when you email the federal government, just be aware that you are potentially opening yourself up to having those emails be foyable, as we call it, subject to Freedom of Information Act. So I always say if you have to talk about something sensitive, that you talk about it, not email about it. Couple other things to keep in mind. ACL has no control over the funding. We do submit a budget that's based on guidance from, it's the president's budget, the executive budget, so it's based on guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. And of course, Congress is the final appropriator of budgets of funding, so we don't really have a lot of influence there. We are part of the executive branch, of course, so that means that we can't just go talk to Congress. We have a process for that. They have to ask us questions and we can respond. So again, whereas at the state level, you can go talk to your legislature, go talk to Congress. We can't do that directly. Next slide. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about you being a new state ombudsman. And, you're coming at a very interesting time with our COVID-19 front and center. So it kind of, I'm sure, has just got you spinning in circles. But it's really important when you can to find time to take a step back and really look at your program. Even if, I think Carol will probably show you there's some great evaluation tools. You can go as in-depth as those evaluation tools, but even more broadly, just kind of listing out, where you locate organizationally and what does that mean? Are you a state employee? Do you have local ombudsman entities, or do you have direct employees? What does that mean? If you have local entities, how do you then provide that oversight that is required when they're not your direct employees, right? So that's kind of a different level of oversight, different way than if you have direct employees in a centralized program, which supervising direct employees has a whole other set of challenges, right? So do you have volunteers or not? What's the history in your state for the state ombudsman to be able to conduct systemic advocacy? So, for instance, I came from a state that had a long history of very out there systemic advocacy at the legislature, with the regulators, and so I had to step into those shoes. Is that your situation, or is it one where there hasn't been so much? And if so, why is that? And how can you approach those what we call systems issues, where you see that, say, you would like to engage in whether it's regulation work at your state or proposed legislation? How do you engage in that? That is part of your job. How do you figure that out? Next slide.
So, Louise, if I could ask a question right here. Many of these people have come in after ACL did a report on each state when the new rule came in. Is there a way for these people to access their report and what they were doing or what their predecessor was doing to meet the requirements?
Yeah, so good question. So basically with the Ombudsman program finally got a regulation through. It passed in 2015, or it was final in 2015, and it went into effect in 2016. And what ACL did was we looked at every state and kind of lined up what we could find in terms of the state level laws, regulations, policies, and procedures, lined that up to what was in the federal regulation and looked for gaps. And then we did it on an Excel spreadsheet, and then we sent that to the state, and we said, here's what we see as your gap. You know, if you've got more information and we're wrong, tell us. If not, tell us, give us your plan for when you're going to correct. So yes, I have for every state, I have the plan, I have the response, I have all the backup documents the state may have sent. So yep, I know one state never had policies and procedures, and now they do. So I have all of that. So if you can't find that, if you didn't inherit your previous state ombudsman computer with all of that work on it, or you can't figure out what's what, let me know, and I can. We probably want to have a meeting and review it. That would be helpful in giving you kind of another way of assessing the program, kind of where it was and where it is now somewhat. We tried to kind of tie the loop on these assessments. We call them assessments. So in terms of the regulation, and kind of tried to close them out with states with, either you've met all the goals, you met everything that you needed to take care of. That might have been one closure, or it might have been you finished most, but X, Y, and Z are still pending. So yeah, I can let you know where that's at. So another thing as you think about assessment is to think about your own history and experience with the Ombudsman program and with long-term services and supports. Are you brand new to the program, or have you worked with the Ombudsman program before? That's going to make a difference. You may have worked as a regional ombudsman before, and if so, you come with that kind of basic knowledge of understanding complaint handling and maybe your data system and, those kinds of things. But then stepping into the shoes of state ombudsman, there are some differences. And so you kind of have to step into that broader role of, being the statewide leader, for instance. If you're brand new to ombudsman work and you maybe worked in long-term services in some other way, you're going to understand that broad background, but it's a very different orientation to come to the Ombudsman program and really understand what this resident-directed advocacy is about and what it really means to not disclose information and to not be a mandated reporter. Those could be real, big changes in your professional orientation. So you kind of have to think of those things. A few other things, how comfortable are you with public speaking? Is that something that if you're not comfortable, do you need to get some outside help to learn how to do that? Are you uncomfortable with conflict? If you are, you've got to figure out, how do I get more comfortable with living with conflict? And also, things like data, budgets. Have you developed budgets before? Do you know how to monitor budgets? All of this is part of your job, or you are, if not directly your job, you're overseeing somebody who has that responsibility. And so you've got to have, you've got to learn these things if you don't have those experiences. So kind of pulling that together, what does this all mean? What are your potential barriers when you think of your organizational location? What are the expectations that are placed on you? Do you have conflicts of interest in your organization? So, for instance, if you're in a large agency with all kinds of services provided, how do you make sure that people understand that, you can't just tap into the case management system to look up information? You can't do that. Or they can't just ask for your records and that they're shared, right? So how do you make sure people understand that, especially when I see it in particular at a lot of state units, there's kind of frequent turnover of leadership, turnover of key staff, fiscal staff, et cetera. So you've got to kind of really learn your organization, what are the benefits and what might be the distractions or the challenges, and how do you work within that. Next slide. So when you think of your history and skills, especially if you're new to the world of ombudsman, what does that mean for you and what you need to learn, how others are going to view you? And I guess I say that because, sometimes when I think back to when I was the state ombudsman, for instance, I was called a professional complainer one time, or one time or several times, because I followed in the footsteps of somebody who'd been there a long time and really kind of grew the program. He was very wonderful and gregarious, and everybody knew him. And then I'd worked with him for many years, but then I became the state ombudsman, and I found out later people underestimated me. So, how are you coming to the program, So it's interesting a couple of years down the road to say, oh, wow, we just really underestimated you. It's like, well, thank you very much. So, people are going to, maybe they're seeing you in a new light, or you're brand new to them. The other thing to be aware of is people are paying attention, even if it doesn't seem like it. Surveyors are paying attention to you. I wasn't even aware of that until I left the program, and then had people, I saw a bunch of surveyors at a gathering in Washington State, and they just, we just, miss you, and, it's like, you knew who I was, because I didn't know who all they were, because they're spread out throughout the state. So people are looking at you. You are the leader of an important statewide program. And so, you've got to think about all that. And, you'll grow into the position. It takes a while to learn it. So you've got to give yourself time. But, so a couple other things. Again, I want to stress this, too, about how you manage conflict, because, a big part of your job is overseeing resolving problems. And so you are going to hear complaints about, say, your staff ombudsman or a volunteer, and how, they're not doing it right according to what I think. That is common. And, you have to be aware that sometimes especially if it's a facility administrator complaining about one of your local representatives, don't panic and think, oh no, they did something wrong. You've got to be that calm, take a step back, look into it, follow your processes when there's a complaint about one of your representatives. And often you might find, they were doing the right thing. They were supporting the resident. And so you're going to find yourself in those tussles, and you've got to get comfortable with it. You also have to know your program's policies and make sure that those policies and procedures are being used and are in place, so that when there is, say, a complaint about a representative of the office, that you've got your system in place. Okay, we have a grievance policy. Here's how it works. Well, this doesn't quite maybe doesn't even rise to the level of a grievance? How do you resolve it informally to kind of calm everybody down? So you kind of have to figure out how you maneuver through all these different systems, working with providers, working with your representatives of the office. If you are a decentralized program, you've got host agencies. So, welcome to the world of state ombudsman. You are busy. And I don't mean to overwhelm you, but it is the reality. And to me, it was what I liked so much about it, is there was so much variety. Next slide. Okay, let's see. We're going to go ahead and skip over. I think I covered that pretty well. Another thing to think about, again, I'm just kind of going down the list pretty fast here, is what are your resources and inputs? Who are your staff, meaning your representatives of the office, both paid and volunteer? Do you have staff at your state office that work for your program? What kind of agency support do you have, whether it's fiscal, front office, IT, management? Who's your legal counsel? And what does your budget look like? Have you looked at it? That's really important, to look at your budget. Have you been asked? Let's see, we're in May. A lot of agencies might have already done their budgeting by now. If your fiscal year starts July 1, what's going on with your budget? What is your data system? And get into that system. Make sure you set yourself up, or you're set up as a user. And that one thing I think state ombudsmen do, and I was guilty of this, is forget to put in their own work into that data system. So, if you are ending up working a complaint, or you go talk to a resident council or a family council, make sure that gets into the system. Training, what does your training look like for designation or certification training? Have you gone through your certification training? Make sure that you go through the certification training that everybody else goes through, so that, one, you kind of learn from a different perspective what's going on in your state. And I'm saying this mostly if you're new to the ombudsman world, but I would say even go through it a second time a few months down the road to see, does this training work for our program? Do we need to make changes? What is your travel like? Are you able to travel throughout the state and meet with your local programs or your local staff? What's the travel budget? Are you able to get to when we have in-person training again, is there money in your budget to get to those in-person trainings in the spring and in the fall? So those are things for you to think about. I want you, when you have a chance, to be sure you read the Ombudsman Program Regulations. And in particular, look at the functions and responsibilities of the state long-term care ombudsman. And basically, there is a long list of what you do, either personally or through representatives of the office. And I'm not going to read this all to you, but I did want to highlight a few things. One of the big ones is to identify, investigate, and resolve complaints. Also, you want to look at, what does it mean to represent the interests of residents before government agencies? Okay, what does that mean? How do you do that? How do you take administrative, legal, and other remedies to protect the health, safety, welfare, and rights of residents? That might not be something you're ready to fully step into, but that is part of the job. So what does that mean? Can you speak to legislators? Are you at the table when there's regulatory revisions? Do you talk to the media? Those are all part of that, representing the interests of residents. Again, to analyze, comment on, and monitor the development and implementation of federal, state, and local laws, regulations, etc. So that's a part of your job that my kind of broad observations that for some folks who've been serving as a regional ombudsman, they may have done that at a regional level or they may not have. So that might be an area of growth. For somebody who's very new to this ombudsman world, it might be, just a whole new area that you need to learn about and figure out some approaches. So a couple other things I'm going to mention is it's kind of in the small print there, but it's under number, I can't even read that. It's 9B. Okay, it is 9B. It's about that you're the head of a unified statewide program, right? So how do you, as a head of a unified statewide program, what does that look like, right? Do you have meetings regularly with, whether it's local staff that you supervise, representatives of the office, or through your contracted representatives of the office? How do you build that we are a statewide program, we are networked, we are a cohesive program? So those are some things. Designation. You can designate a person to represent your office and you can take that away. And both happen. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to take away someone's designation. So you need to learn, what does it mean when I designate someone? What are the criteria? And what does it mean if I have to take that away? What are the criteria to de-designate? Just some things just to keep overwhelming you. Next slide. Okay, I'm actually go back. Let's see, designation. Yeah. Is that the next slide? Okay. So
these other ones, you had all of this kind of at the bottom, and I just put them on to a new slide.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, and I guess the other thing I want to say about designation is if you have local entities, you're not only designating people as representatives of the office, but you're designating an agency to house a local entity. And that requires monitoring and ensuring that there's not conflicts of interest that can't be remedied, etc. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk more about disclosure later, but I did want to say, when you think of the Ombudsman program and what we mean by disclosure is that your program does not share resident or complainant identifying information without their consent, right? So the resident has to give you, your program, consent to take action on a complaint and talk to others to resolve it. That includes even talking to facility staff. The resident has to say, yes, I want you to do that, right? So I think people understand that part pretty well, that to take action on a complaint or to share resident information or complainant information, you need their consent. We have exceptions to that when a resident can't express themselves and there's no decision maker, for instance. So there's that part of disclosure, thinking more about the resident. But you also have to think about your program and your records, right? Your program records, whether that's your case files, whether that's emails, whether that's your representative of the office observed something or had a conversation with someone, all of that is protected. All of that is is not disclosable. Do not disclose unless you have consent of the resident or complainant and the state ombudsman says okay. And we'll get more into this later. But you will have state auditors knocking on your door. You will have the AG's office wanting data. You might have the Federal Department of Justice. You might have BuzzFeed saying, give me your database. So all of them, I say you start with a no. Your state Freedom of Information Act does not apply. The Federal Freedom of Information Act does not apply. You start with a no, and then you figure out if there's a reason to go to yes. So that's my quick and dirty. Somebody says, give me your record. They're a lawyer for a resident. You don't have to hand anything over. Take your time and figure it out. So I just want to really emphasize that your records are protected, and we've had to go as far as telling the state that if you do not protect these records, you risk your federal funding. So we had a state that the auditor's office was insistent that they looked at case files. And we told them no many ways, very nicely, over and over. And until we said, if you do this, you will risk your federal funding, did they stop. So I want to be clear, auditors do not get your case records. A lawyer sends a subpoena over, it does not mean anything. It's a subpoena. It's not a judge's order. So you have to look at the facts and determine does it make sense or not. So if that comes, and we'll talk more about this later in a future session, but if that comes up and you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me and I can provide more technical assistance on that. And sometimes you'll find, even if the resident says, yes, it's okay to release my record, you as state ombudsman may have reasons to not release the record, and you can still say no. So couple things, a lot of questions come up about fiscal management. I would say this has been a real hot topic in light of the CARES Act funding. And what does this mean? So in general, it means that you as the state ombudsman determine the use of fiscal resources appropriated or otherwise available to operate your office. So your office that's not the whole program, that's your office of ombudsman. And then where you have entities, if you contract out and have local entities, you approve their allocations and then you monitor their budget. So when I was state ombudsman, we were fortunate that we got the whole pot of money and we rented down our own allocation formula to give out to the local programs. So very much in control of that. For many of you, it's a much more hybrid approach that has challenges. With the CARES Act, I know there were a lot of questions that came up because the challenge is because of the Stafford Act declarations. In theory, the state unit can take any pot of Older Americans Act money and use for any purpose. So there was some verbalizing, well, gee, the Ombudsman program doesn't necessarily get this money because of the Stafford Act anyhow. So if you have questions about the current CARES Act funding, fiscal management, kind of the inner workings of your state, I'm happy to discuss that with you. We also have our fiscal specialists at ACL. If you don't know heads or toes about a budget and what it means to develop a budget or to monitor a budget, then I really recommend you find a class. There's lots of different, I'm sure, online options, just basic, budgeting for government, budgeting for nonprofits, whatever makes sense to you, to kind of learn a little bit more about that. Another important part of your functions and responsibilities is the annual report that you are to independently develop and provide final approval of an annual report. It doesn't mean you have to type every keystroke of that annual report, but I really, especially because we're changing to a new reporting system, I really expect state ombudsmen to be engaged in this next year's report in January 2021, and we'll talk more about the OF later. But the annual report that you create also is to be shared with many different entities. So that's another thing to be aware of. Next slide. So I've said this before, but I'll say it again, that you are a statewide leader of a very important program, and people will look up to you and look at you and sometimes look at you funny, but you are a statewide leader and your program is very important. You have power in your authority and duties, and think of some of this power, access to residents and their records. Not everybody can do that. Access to a facility really at any time. You have that authority. The authority to say no when somebody wants your records. The authority to designate and de-designate. To be that voice, that public policy voice. That's all part of your job, and so you can see how important it is. But you also need to be aware of your challenges in your state, the politics, the barriers, and how to work around those. And it is a process. And you're not going to learn this job in 6 months. You're going to get more confident in 6 months. You'll be more confident in a year. It's a job that, really you never stop learning. And that's one of the things I really liked about the job. And you want to just see that you are, over time, gaining more proficiency. You're going to probably focus. Sometimes you're going to be focusing more on how do I monitor programs. Later, you might really be more into how am I going to, work the systems advocacy. We've got some laws that need fixing. How do I change that? So that's all kind of part of your job. You can't do it all in a day. We're going to talk more about NORS later, the National Ombudsman Reporting System. We did change and revise the NORS. The NORS is the data collection. It's the codes. Right now, NORS is presented in 3 tables. That is NORS. We're going to talk more about NORS later, but it is important that you, again, learn your software. Make sure that your representatives have consistent and routine data entry. That also means that they are typically also entering the data of the volunteers, if you have volunteer representatives. Run monthly reports, and at a minimum, expect that everybody is at a minimum submitting, not only entering data routinely, but submitting to you reports that where they describe and analyze their data. I came from a state where the local programs and the state office had to do a monthly report. And that report was, you can ask Patricia Hunter, the state ombudsman now, they still do it. And it's shared with a lot of people. So it's very transparent and it keeps everybody on their data entry toes. Thinking about data, though, also think about how do you tell your state's story. When trying to talk about a systems advocacy issue, it often helps to have the story of the resident that brings it really real, and then the data to match that, to support that. If you're advocating for a problem, about a problem, make sure you've got some solutions. So these are things that data can help you figure out. Next slide. So here's an example of the data. So we've used admission, transfer, discharge, eviction to paint a picture, and you can just see here the data. It's always nice when you can have a little chart. You can see the growing number of C-19 discharge eviction complaints, right? So when you're trying to fix a legislative or a problem about admission, transfer, discharge, here's a great visual. It's data, it's numbers, and it's a visual. And then you have a story of somebody who got kicked out and was stuck in the hospital. You know, you have their picture. It really comes together nicely. Next slide. Yeah, so there's just an example of the data with the story. So we can move on. The other thing is, I got this card in the mail. So it's not from the Ombudsman program, but I thought, what a great way to share data. And so think about these things too when you're trying to get your message across. And it was a postcard. And so I just thought that was a very handy idea. And we're getting near the end. I want to leave a little time for questions. Memorandum of Understanding. So the regulation and in the Older Americans Act, it talks about how the Ombudsman should develop kind of formal ways to coordinate and communicate with other agencies, such as protection and advocacy systems, Medicaid fraud, state survey agencies. There's a laundry list of them. The only one that's required is with your state legal assistance developer and legal assistance programs. So it's part of when we did our regulation review of states, we looked to see, did your state have MOUs with any entities at all? And found that some did, some didn't, some had them with some and not others. So the only one you really have to have is with your 3D legal assistance and legal assistance developer, and we've got some good examples there. But with a real benefit to having a memorandum of understanding, I kind of thought those states that had them with their state survey agency, that it came in really handy in light of COVID-19, that they had some agreed upon language about information sharing and who would do what. And that really came in handy during this pandemic. So there's more information that we provided at ACL about memorandums of understanding. But if you are like, what is that? And what? It might be totally new to you, and that's okay. It sounds more technical than it has to be. But the Resource Center has great examples. And again, when you think about your assessment, who does the program coordinate with, communicate with, if you're not sure, you want to start figuring out, well, who are the players? And then once you figure that out, then it's like, well, do we have any formal agreements on how we communicate? And it might not be called a memorandum of understanding. I know when I was state ombudsman with the state survey agency, they called it a data share agreement, and it was the same thing. So, start again. You're exploring, trying to figure out what you have, what you don't have, and so with our assessment through that ACL did, I can also help. If you're not sure, we can look at that and see what we found, what was submitted. And we've got pretty good records of all that. And again, this is the list in the regulation of all of the types of agencies. And you'll see there's 10 listed where you may have a memorandum of understanding. And it says, and other means, so it doesn't have to be an MOU. But the only one that's required is required because it's in the Older Americans Act. Again, that's the legal assistance and developer and legal assistance program. Next slide. Okay. We can move on. I'm not sure why. Okay, and then a question. How often should you consider updating your MOU? I think it really depends. I think it's probably good to look at them every year or two and see if they're still relevant or if things need to be changed. A lot of times they don't need a lot of updating. So if you're, still, you're all new, and if you have MOUs, it's a good time to look at them and just see if they work. You may not know enough yet to know how well they're working. So you may want to look at them now, look at them a year later, talk to the parties who signed the MOU, just kind of see how it works. And, they're not meant to be static, but you don't want to constantly change them and kind of, because it might confuse some of your ongoing processes. Let's see. Carol, can you back up? I think we missed the slide. Oh, okay. Yeah. Next slide. Okay. This was just a little bit about why we have it and how we have it with regards to legal assistance. But we only have 8 minutes, right, Carol? So let's, I want to talk for a minute about, you can go back up to the legal, that one, yeah. Just a couple of words about legal services. So there's a couple things going on. You should identify who is your legal counsel for the Office of the Ombudsman. Who do you turn to if you need to talk to a lawyer? They often, that person that might be at your Attorney General's office, for instance, they're not going to be the person typically who would represent residents, right? So then you need to understand who out in the field provides legal services to residents. And it's often that 3B attorney or some other kind of public legal service that is available to provide services to residents. And that's where having that MOU is so important, because you want to make sure that, say, maybe with your local legal services, that they'll make it a priority when a resident is discharged or has a discharge notice and there's complications with the eviction, with going to fair hearing, that for some reason they need legal support, that they will make that a priority. So those are some of the ways that an MOU could be really helpful around those referrals. So, and so that's why, again, it's a required one, but it's really important because of the benefits of coordinating to help residents with their legal services. Okay, next slide. There you go. I just want to say in closing, I really do think it's the best job ever, and I hope you'll stay with it. You hopefully will, really embrace it. It's a very unique job and with a great responsibility, and you also have great authority. You will always learn and you'll never get bored. But I've just given you kind of a big dump of here's your job, and it's overwhelming. So you've got to pace yourself. You can't do it all. You can't do it all in one day or 1 month or 1 year. You're going to have strengths and weaknesses. Know what those are. Know what your program strengths and weaknesses are. What are your personal strengths and weaknesses? What are the peculiarities of your state and of your employer? And learn that, because you have to maneuver all that. You have to find your pathway through. And celebrate your successes, big and small. Okay, and so we have a few minutes for questions. Any big questions or comments?
Yeah, so if you want to speak, please feel free to unmute yourself, and we'll see.
And there's no such thing as a dumb question, that's for sure. And I just want to make sure I know who some of the newer folks are. So Jan, is from, what state is Jan from?
That's Patty, I think.
Hmm? Oh,
So-
you're muted.
Jan is,
Montana.
Montana. Oh, welcome, welcome. Okay.
Originally from North Dakota
Oh, okay.
and came down from Alaska.
Oh, wow. Okay. And I've talked to Michael before on the phone. Welcome,
Yes.
Michael. And
Yeah.
I talked to Lisa on the phone. I think Mary from Mississippi. Tika, I haven't talked to Mary yet. Tika from Tennessee, and we have talked. Amanda in Idaho. Patricia, I don't know if we talked. Patricia from Wyoming. Welcome.
I believe we
And-
have, Louise.
Good. Okay. And Stephanie, and I know we talked, and so yeah. And Donna from, is that Donna from South Dakota?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We're
Good. I
trying
just
our
wanted-
best not to have the same names be used over and over, but
Right.
you know, some of these new people are not following the rules already, which just shows that they're like so much a part of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's great. And I see some other newer folks on the phone too, but for the really new folks, I wanted to make sure I identified who you were and where you were from. So,
Louise, I'm sorry. I know I've been a problem child so far, but at least the name is different. So I've tried to follow at least that rule so far.
well, it's a nice name, and you've not been a problem child at all. And you even told me you like data, so hey, that's scoring points there.
Yes, I'm working on it. We had an interesting situation. I've had 3 predecessors in the last few years, so getting the data together, and after that, I think I'm squared away with you for a while.
Good. Okay. Great. Yeah. It's, yeah. You found some interesting things. Like, what?
Well, I tell you what, Louise, we want to thank you very much for overwhelming everyone. Even those that have been doing this job for a few years are sitting there going, oh crap, I forgot all about that part of the job. So thanks for the throwing it all at us at once, and especially the advice that you can only do what you can do. So whether you are working by yourself or whether you have the luxury of having other state staff, you just need to make your list and work it as best you can. So I want to thank you for being here. For those of you that are mentors, if any of you want to volunteer for the June 3rd webinar to help with the surviving the first year or surviving this year, if you want to let me know, I'd be happy to. You don't have to let me know now. You can email me and let me know if you'd like to be on that. We'll try to do maybe a panel like we've done with just Q&A with everybody. So any last words? We've got 20 seconds.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. I mean, you've been, what a time to start with the Ombudsman program. I mean, who would have thunk it, you know? So hang in there. I mean, everybody is overwhelmed, but you've got the extra of being new. And you've got great mentors out there. Reach out to your peers if they are a wealth of knowledge and support. So don't be shy. It can be a lonely feeling sometimes, so be sure to reach out. Yeah.
I think the fact that we have so many mentors that listened in on this is a testament to how many times you just have to hear the same information over, and just they're wanting to show support for the new folks. So we'll do this again next week, same time, same bat channel. And as always, if you need anything, reach out to Louise, reach out to the Resource Center, or reach out to your colleagues. Everybody have a safe evening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.